Namaste and good evening, everyone. Welcome back to our continuing series, Evenings with Sraddhalu. Namaste, Sraddhalu.
Namaste, happy to be with all of you.
We are happy to continue our series, and today we will take more questions on the topic of secrets of occult science. And we have received some questions related on a new discussion, the outer body experiences. During our conversation, please, you may have freely address questions in the chat box, and we will take your question if it's related with our subject. So I will start reading a first question from Trinetra. During outer body experiences, does the psychic being leaves the physical, or is it just the vital being that leaves while the mental being and the psychic being remain behind?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's coming to a theme that we have touched before on several occasions. And I thought this is an occasion for us to be able to go much deeper into the topic of out-of-body experiences. Technically, Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase exteriorization. So in the occult knowledge systems, the correct phrase is exteriorization because our consciousness is exteriorized, projected out of, externalized from our subjective, physical, individual awareness. Because out of body as a description can be done in many ways, including just a kind of a daydream, which is also as if an out of body. The mother and Sri Aurobindo have spoken of these in some depth. The mother herself was a master occultist, as you know, during a certain period of her training. In the later years, she said, I don't remember those things, and yet the ability, the capacities which she had of being able to go through different worlds and to go out of the body, the degree of mastery she had is so exceptional as we might say there would be a handful of people in the whole of humanity currently or at any given time who might have such an ability. She herself received that training from Madame Théon, who was one such exceptional occultist. And of course, she had powers which the mother herself never got into, but that was just her phase of training. She describes how Madame Théon could go out of the body into her, let's say, subtle body, leave that to go into a still subtler body, and then leave that and go into a still subtler, and so on, up to 12 times. The mother herself learned, or rather developed, that capacity. And on the 12th, which is the finest grade, where the sense of form itself fades out, on the brink of that world of form and the formless, is a very difficult state to hold, but she was able to stay there. And then she crossed over into the formless briefly. It's again considered in the occult tradition something very risky, because they say once you cross over, you can't come back, because there is complete oblivion of form itself. But Mother briefly was able to dip into as if that side and glimpsed there the prototype of the supramental body, which later Sri Aurobindo confirmed. And all this is to say that the authority with which she speaks is unsurpassed as far as these experiences are concerned. I don't think she ever fully got into the extreme forms of materialization and dematerialization and such capacities which are not so central to development of consciousness, though she did describe how she was able to project her consciousness at a distance to a group that was sitting in Paris, and then take a pen and move it to sign, and then it was confirmed later. So that obviously represents a certain capacity to materialize from the subtle body. All this is just to give you the background of the scope that she had in her own rich experience. Before I come to the question itself, there are very interesting descriptions that the mother has of some of these experiences, some things she saw, but also that when she was speaking to the young children in the playground, as well as some of the sadhakas, she spoke of these things. And at times, as we will see shortly, she revealed certain secrets, which I think to this day people do not fully realize what she has actually revealed in those conversations. One of the earliest ones, let's say, actually, it's one of the later ones, in fact, where she speaks of this in response to a question. Someone asks, what is this awareness of worlds beyond that Sri Aurobindo speaks of? And she asks, what are you asking about? Do you want to know what those worlds are or how to go there? And he says, the means of going there. Mother's response, the means of going there? Oh, do you know how to exteriorize yourself? Now, I'm continuing to read. She will ask a series of questions. I will pause on each one, and just so that you can realize that she's describing to you the steps, the stages of what can be mastered potentially as a skill. So, do you know how to exteriorize yourself? Do you even know what it means to exteriorize oneself? Not philosophically or psychologically, I mean occultly. Are you conscious in your exteriorization? Do you do it at will? Do you know how to leave your body and live in a more subtle body? And then again leave that body and live in another more subtle body? And so on. Do you know how to do all that? Have you ever done it? No? Then we shall speak about it again another day. And she leaves that part of the discussion. But if you see in the series of questions she asks, she is already giving you the hint of what are the stages or the steps of what is possible. So first is exteriorization. It may happen to you unconsciously. You may or may not recall. It may happen suddenly, you find yourself, I'm out. And then you slip into sleep state or dream state and lose it because it was inadvertent. Next, in your exteriorization, you could be like a zombie, as often happens, but can you become conscious in it? Becoming conscious, I've read literature, a lot of people who seem to be able to get it once in a while, just like that. They don't know when, they try every day, but one day it happens. It's not in their control. She says, do you do it at will? Now that's already a level of mastery, that you should be able to lie down and consciously exteriorize, project yourself and do what's required, and then come back. Now, even the best literature that you find published of people who are treated as authorities in out-of-body experience, like Monroe and others, don't get it at will. It happens once in a while, and that's it. When it happens, they are conscious, and that's all. But to be able to do like this is a level of mastery quite far. Then, once you leave your body and are in a more subtle body, again to leave that and live in a still more subtle. And then she says, and so on. How many times do you think it can happen? There's another conversation where somebody asks, how many dimensions? And mother says, 12. That's it. Nobody asks more, she doesn't speak more. Then, do you know how to do all that? That's again telling you that you can have the knowledge of how to do theoretically, but then there is the experience of how to do, and then there's the doing it on a frequent or regular way. So all this is to show you that it's a skill which can be developed. Some have a knack, some don't, but sometimes it might require years of effort to be able to attain to that kind of even basic exteriorization, to be able to then shift levels across planes and so on. Now, coming to the question itself, the Trinetra has asked, what is it that leaves? Mother explains that most often what happens is some part of the vital, So in Trinathra's question, I want to highlight the implicit bias that we all have in our understanding. Is it just the vital being that leaves while the mental being and psychic remain behind? So we tend to think of these bodies as very distinct pieces. It's a way of describing it, perhaps. But in your experience, as you say, I have emotions, I have thoughts. But in your experience, can you actually disconnect them sufficiently to say this is pure thought and that is pure emotion? Or do you find the two blended? Inevitably, you have an emotional impulse with a thought content, or you have a thought impulse with an emotional content. It may be less or more. You can't really separate the two. And so it is like that also in our subjective experience, both in dream state, the level at which you have the dream, as well as in a deliberate exteriorization. That you may have an exteriorization which is in a layer, in a part of your consciousness, which will be a blend of these. So Mother says in most cases it is the vital. In the mind equally one could have a kind of an exteriorization, and Sri Aurobindo refers to this in some of his letters. What is generally described by them is that a mental exteriorization is easier and also safer. Whereas a vital exteriorization, depending on the grade of the vital, is more difficult and also may be more dangerous if it is too close to the physical domain. I will elaborate on this as we go along. So now you have to think of it this way. There is the physical substance, which has as if finer and finer grades of physical substance, which then turn towards the vital and mental. There is the vital substance, which has denser grades and finer grades. And the denser grade of the vital leans towards the physical density, finer grades leans towards the mental density and substantial quality. Similarly, in the mental substance, there are grades which lean towards the vital, towards the physical, and so on. The physical content of the physical content of the vital, physical content of the mental blend to form what we will call the subtle physical body. In the vital, similarly, content of the physical, subtle physical blends, content of the mental blends in, and one could create therefore almost a continuum, an infinity of gradations. You could open out to any of these in a dream state or in an exteriorization. So when this question is put, I would set aside the specific of the question and rather take the spirit of it. What leaves? What stays? When the initial experience takes place, most often it is in the vital, as we said, and it is there that you will find the character of your vital being is then deciding what is the kind of experience you will have. If normally you live in a crude, coarse, vital nature, untrained, unrefined, you will find yourself made of substance of that crude, coarse, untrained material. What happens in that plane, your reactions will all be impulsive, instinctive of that grade that you have developed. The higher gradations of the vital will be blocked to you because this is all that you are identified with. Similarly, if you find yourself in the mental consciousness, in a mental exteriorization, then depending on the quality of your mental awareness and the grade of your mental evolution, you will find yourself in that plane with those tendencies. Now, the point I'm trying to highlight is you cannot be a mental being while in a vital exteriorization because you're in the vital body and not primarily in the mental. There is a mental component in it, but it is the vital which is your primary identity. Just as in the physical body, you're primarily the physical substance, your mind and vital fuse in. But if your body hurts, your mind and vital are affected. If your body is tired, your mind and vital are dulled. So similarly, in the vital consciousness, you will have a content of the mental awareness, which will try to wield your vital body, but primarily the vital body will be what your primary identity is. Therefore, in order to be able to freely wander over these domains, you must have taken your vital and mental awareness through a process of refinement, control, and self-mastery. To the extent that you have this self-mastery, to that extent you will be able to wander on those planes consciously, intentionally. Now, one of the things which every wanderer of out-of-body experience has to deal with, has to pass through, is this passage of the vital world. Even if you're going to enter the mental domains, there is the, so to say, passage through the vital. Inevitably, that is experienced as a huge ocean of desires, instincts, compulsions, drives, passions, waves of these pull, push, play. And if you have not developed in your physical life a degree of mastery and equality, you'll find yourself sucked into it, swayed, torn apart even in a sense, with the intensities of those experiences. And the only thing by which you can get through that is a solid foundation of equality. You cannot control it. It is more powerful than you. It's an ocean kicking you, so to say, like a little boat pushed around. All this is to tell you what you need to do if you really want to explore these things. Entering the mental plane, though, is relatively easier if you have made a partial mental exteriorization, bypassing the vital. This is generally what happens when we daydream or when we think of somebody very strongly. It's as if a part of your mind reaches out and immediately touches. What? The other person's mental consciousness. They may or may not be conscious. You may not be conscious also. But the fact of thinking and remembering creates a link. And often just with that, some kind of a touch takes place. So this is easier. And so a kind of a mental projection into the mental worlds is also relatively easier, relatively safer. But then the vital consciousness is as if left back. So look at it this way. You have a whole range of gradations, physical, vital, mental, with all the blends and mixtures in between. Out of these, a certain part could as if project out. But how much, which range, which combination is as if your choice. So let's look at some of the more interesting ones. Not easy necessarily. The vital tending to the physical is the range where you can, projecting out, experience something of the physical world. And it is also the range from which you would be able to densify enough to be able to influence the physical world, as the mother did in moving a pencil. There is a grade still further closer to the physical, which belongs properly to the subtle physical. And the subtle physical, as you know, you can feel if you bring your hands together at a certain distance and about 2 centimeters, you relax them and hold together. After a while, you can feel a sensation as if something here, some layer here is touching another layer here. And that's the contact of your denser, subtle physical layer. It of course has finer gradations, but this is what you can feel in the denser layer. There is a grade which is even finer within that. And that's the layer in which, if you can project out, your physical body goes into a trance, which can approach a cataleptic trance, meaning the heartbeat slows down so much that you will hardly feel it, and the body will even become cold. But at that point, you're projecting out at a level which is very close to the physical, and you can wander as if exploring the physical world. There are great dangers because your substance is nearly physical over there in your subtle body. And if there you have an injury, it immediately transfers into your gross physical because it's literally one substance. Just that this wandering part is an exteriorization of a grade of your physical body. So it's wandering around, but from there it is easy to see the physical world and also to materialize. And those would be the cases where somebody has two bodies, as if. So you're sitting here, let's say in concentration or in trance, meditation, or lying down. You project the body now because it's not gross physical. You can project it anywhere in the world and materialize the form there. So it may seem to people there as if you have appeared. Depending on the degree of materialization, they will be able to see you. First, they will be able to feel you without seeing you. Second grade, they will be able to see you, but their hand might still pass through you, like classic ghost form. Further densification, they will be able to touch. And if at that point, of course, you are most vulnerable, an injury there will affect your physical body instantly. Also, at that point, and for that degree of materialization, your physical body here, which is in trance, is also extremely vulnerable. Because the prime content of your physical consciousness is out, something can come in and try to interfere with the link, with this continuing projection, the link which bridges the two. And Mother describes this. I am summarizing what she has described over several different descriptions, passages. At that point, she says, if somebody interferes, the link might be disconnected. Somebody asks, is it possible for you to then reconnect? Yes, she says it is possible, but it is extremely painful. Because the thing which has been, so to say, taken out, now re-infusing, there is, she describes as a kind of a friction of the infusion of a dense substance. It's literally as if your physical density of substance is being pressed into the same density of substance. There's a fine difference of grade, but still, it's literally crushing body into body to fuse and reconnect. Extremely painful, she says. And then in another conversation, she has shared her own experience of this. She had gone out of body through those 12 layers into that world on the border of form and formless. And at that point there, Theon was sitting there protecting her body. Monsieur Theon, the Mr. Theon. And he asked, and he was interested in the secret of life. And Mother says she had got it, and he asked that she should reveal it to him. And she said no. He got very angry. He threatened to hurt her. She still refused. At which point, in his anger, he intervened and cut the connection between her physical body and the subtle layers, which had all been exteriorized already. Now, at that point, the link broken, technically you are dead. But because it has just happened, there's still this grade which is very dense linking, like a thin familiar memory, so to say. It's not even a link, it's a familiar memory. And at that point, one can still reconnect while the death is fresh. And so she began that effort. He himself realized what a mistake he had made from his anger, and he also did what he could to help, and she was able to come back and re-enter the body. So this experience is extremely rare in human history. It might have been had by some of the most advanced occultists in time of accident, so to say, because nobody would deliberately break the link and then rejoin. And so it's quite interesting that we have the record of the Mother sharing what it's like when this happens. But this is to say that exteriorization close to the physical grade allows for these kinds of phenomena. But that is also the most dangerous. And the physical body there lying down in a state of cataleptic trance is extremely vulnerable. So always somebody has to be present with the necessary occult knowledge and perception who can hold the protection. And this is what gives out-of-body experiences the bad name, because the danger involved with this kind of projection. Mother herself did this same exercise once again after she came back. She came to Pondicherry. At that time, Sri Aurobindo was present, protecting her while she went and once again went to that domain and got the secret of life. She says she noted it on a paper. What that means, in what form it is noted, what that notation represents, we don't know. And that paper apparently later was stolen from her. It was in a box and then it vanished from inside the box. And she refers to that as an occult theft, that it was dematerialized, possibly by Theon, because he was still alive afterwards, even after Mother had come here, I think till up to 1928 or so. But this is to give you a glimpse of that level of projection. I've already spoken of the projections in the exteriorizations in the vital body, which though is the most common also in our dream state. In dream, we rarely go out at this level of physical density. It can happen, but mostly it is accidental, and the number of people who have that may be one in many thousands or millions perhaps. I recall this was K.D. Setna, Amal Kiran, who had shared this at one point with me. I assume he must have documented it in one of his books, but I have not seen all his books, so I don't know. But he shared how one afternoon he was taking a nap and he found himself floating out of the body. And so he was curious, seeing his body on the bed. He comes and I think he passed through the door and then went out for a walk. Oh, what is this? Very interesting. And he describes walking on the beach road, and there were strange plants and strange animals. So that tells you when the form of the domain is very close to the physical, you have things which look exactly like the physical. So there's a beach road, there is the ocean, etc. But there are tiny differences depending on how close you are to the physical. As you move up the gradations, even in the subtle physical domains, it becomes slightly more and more different. In the full freedom of the subtle physical world, everything is felt as if larger, wider, vaster, freer. So, for example, Mother describes how the subtle physical ashram, which is overlaid on the physical space of the physical ashram, the rooms are much bigger because the consciousness itself is more wide, more plastic. It tends towards a more subjective form. But this was close enough that he was seeing the physical world and walking around as if, not realizing perhaps that he could float, but that's the habit of the physical body. Coming back to his room, he looked inside some house, and there was somebody sitting, and he said it was a kind of a strange, hostile being. And the man looked back at him with such virulence that it was as if he was attacked by the very gaze. And he felt sick, and he woke up in his physical body, completely sick, drained out of energy and sick. And at that point, he had Sri Aurobindo's Savitri, and he began to read from it, reciting loudly. And gradually over time, the strength came back and the stability of his consciousness came back. And he said it was for him the physical experience of how a recitation of Savitri can have a healing effect. I'm just sharing this as an example of what kinds of things on that low grade close to the physical could be. But the vital proper is where most people find themselves, and they are very dreamlike in quality of experience. You have an experience, you're often floating, you're flying, and so on. You have the sense of a body, but the body itself seems to be made of your emotions and your passions. And that's why you rarely can control. What you fear becomes true. What you intend spontaneously becomes real. Without your having a self-control, then you can easily find yourself getting into fear states, danger states, and all kinds of other things, passions. The mental projection is more interesting, or more safe. And so you have interesting comments about this, both from Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. And I'll describe a little bit what she says about this. She says, when you project yourself mentally, that is, you think of somebody very strongly, you are there's a point of contact, because your mental consciousness is actually unformed, unfixed, and quite plastic and wide. It's not so fixated in the body. It's even surrounding, extending beyond. And so at that point, you're in touch, but you can't know what the person is like, what they're thinking, or even what's happening there physically, because it's a mental contact with mental contact. If at that moment, she says, the person has clear thoughts, you may get a sense of what those thoughts are like. If the person has clear thoughts about what is happening around him physically, you may glimpse the quality of thought of what is happening physically, but not the physical thing itself. So this has its value, but it has its limitations as far as the physical world is concerned. You can, of course, in the mental plane, create mental forms which will then try to activate themselves, actualize themselves. Not easily onto the physical. They don't have a very strong physical influence. The vital consciousness leaning to the physical, and those gradations have a much stronger effect on the physical world. And this is why it is that domain of substance and also beings that magicians use for effecting the physical world. But in the mental world, if you put out a strong mental idea, open it out or spread it widely, people can catch it. So you can contribute greatly to the world by putting out positive ideas, positive thoughts, positive visualizations. Not only you surround yourself with it, but also you help others to catch positive thoughts. This is where we have the mood, we will say, of a group, of a collective, or a nation sometimes. And the media can play a great role. If the media keeps hammering negative messages, the thinking of everybody goes negative, and then mutually there's a resonance of negative thought created, a sense of hopelessness, a sense of doom or gloom. And these often influence collective behaviors on a national level or even as a global level, as happened during the lockdown recently, a couple of years ago. Equally in the vital, you can build strong connections in groups and influences if you have the capacity to put out consciously a projection of the vital. So this is broadly to give you a sense of what's possible across all these levels, and any combination of these is possible as a projection. The projection can be more or less complete. That means a part of you projects, and so the physical body is as if in a sleep state. This is what happens at night in the dream state. A tiny part projects in the vital mental range. You have a dream, you come back, that's it. You're not even conscious that there was a projection. If you put a greater projection, more of your material is taken out, there is less remaining here in the physical body. More and more it goes into cataleptic state, because now there is not enough to sustain the full life force of its working. But the link remains, and that's when, of course, one goes into dangerous zones. Where is the psychic being in all this? Interesting. I will read from the mother's response. I want to, because of what she says is so astounding that. So I will read from two passages. First, where she describes this scale of subtleties of the world. She says the knowledge of the occult worlds is based on the existence of subtle bodies and subtle worlds corresponding to those bodies. They are what psychological methods call states of consciousness, but these states of consciousness really correspond to worlds. The occult procedure consists then in being aware of these various inner states of being or subtle bodies, and in becoming sufficiently a master of them so as to be able to go out of them successively, one after another. There is indeed a whole scale of subtleties, increasing or decreasing according to the direction in which you go. And the occult procedure consists in going out of a denser body into a subtler body, and so on up to the most ethereal regions. You go by successive exteriorizations into bodies or worlds more and more subtle. It is somewhat as if every time you passed into another dimension. The fourth dimension of the physicists is nothing but the scientific transcription of an occult knowledge. To give another image, one can say that the physical body is at the center. It is the most material, the densest, and also the smallest. And the inner bodies, more subtle, overflow more and more the central physical body. They pass through it, extending themselves farther and farther, like water evaporating from a porous vase and forming a kind of steam all around. See, in our normal thinking, we think subtle body is inside. No, subtle body is much more around, interpenetrating, but supporting in the part that interpenetrates, but extending much wider, much freer. And the greater the subtlety, the more the extension tends to unite with that of the universe. One ends up universalizing oneself. So in the most refined, the most fine level, you are as if one with the whole infinity of the universe. And it is altogether a concrete process which gives an objective experience of invisible worlds and even enables one to act in these worlds. Okay, so this is one text which is gives you a sense of this. The idea is you cannot go to the mental world directly for as a conscious being to be able to act there unless you have already exteriorized in part your vital, and out of that exteriorize the mental for exteriorization purposes. In terms of projection, of course, you can do it. That's a different case. But for exteriorization to go to higher levels, you have to as if leave each successively. A similar experience takes place when you go inward towards the psychic being. It's as if you've passed through to finer and finer gradations of consciousness, which are so fine, so subtle, that the sense of form and density begins to fade. So this is just as an aside. There's a very interesting correspondence between these two things. Now, someone asked this question to the mother: is it the psychic being which goes out or some other part of the being? And this is the second piece I wanted to read. And this is a bit shocking for most of us because of our idea of what our relationship is with our psychic being. Mother replies, if it is the psychic being which goes out, one would not be aware of it. The more so as most of the time it is not within you. She says, the psychic being is not within you. What does that mean? She explains. Very few people carry their psychic being within them because the dwelling place is not ready. To experience the psychic being within you, you must have within you the dwelling place that is ready to receive, which means it must have the necessary purity and refinement into which the psychic would accept to settle and settle itself. This is not the case in what we call our personality. So the psychic being is, so to say, supporting from within, but is not seated within you that you say, I am carrying the psychic within. And she continues, what goes out is sometimes the subtle physical. This is when one sees one's body stretched out. For the physical vision to remain conscious, it must be a very material part of the being which goes out. One must go out very materially in the subtle physical body or in the most material vital. But usually it is the vital which goes out, and still more often the mental being. But when it is the mind which goes out, one is not aware of it at all. For the mind is like the psychic. It is very rarely within you. Interesting also. Think about what that means as far as our mental life is concerned. It is rarely within you. If you think of something or somebody, one part of your mind is immediately there. The mind is a vagabond. It roves. It comes and goes. It enters and goes out. There are very few people who have organized their mind sufficiently to keep it within them, close-packed, and prevent it from gadding about. This is a translation. I don't know the French. The word in French would be something, let me see. So, you see, even our mind is generally not sufficiently developed in order for us to say, we are containing the mind within ourselves. I'm still looking for that word in the translation. Vadruye is the word, wandering around basically. So what this means is the mind and the psychic are not sufficiently organized within the personality for us to be able to contain and utilize it as a conscious power. Each time you're daydreaming, it's as if a part of your mind has wandered out. And it may be the central part of your, or the focal point of your awareness, in a mind which is itself like a gas, unfocused, unformed, uncoordinated, or centered. And therefore, that's the kind of mental projection which, as I said, is safe because it's happening in a way that does not affect anything. This description of hers is very interesting because it is also the basis for a whole lot of psychological phenomena which current science is exploring without understanding. And I've spoken about this, which is an effect which is called the phantom hand. If you are shown, for example, a rubber hand, your own hand is hidden behind a screen, and you're shown a rubber hand, and somebody is tickling with a feather the tip of your finger behind the screen, and at the same time the stroke of a feather is shown on your rubber hand. Instantly your mind identifies with the rubber hand. It's fascinating. That means your mind's identification with your physical body also is quite fluid. It's very easy to find it displaced. And perhaps it has happened to you also. So one of the forms in which this experiment is done, you are given goggles, and on the screen in your goggles, a picture of you seen from behind from a video camera is projected. Within a few seconds, you feel as if you're standing behind at the back of the room looking at your body. That kind of dissociation or separation in mental consciousness is immediate, precisely because the mind is so fluid and unorganized. A more organized mind would say, that is different. It would feel a split of awareness, two poises. It could choose where the center is and actually coordinate between the two positions. It takes skill, it takes training. So this is, I wanted to share as regards the psychic being. If the psychic being went out, you wouldn't even know, she says. So I think that covers broadly the scope of the question, and we've widened it enough that we get a pretty good picture of out-of-body experiences. But I want to extend this a little more. It's a topic I have never touched before, or rather I've avoided going deeper, even if touched superficially. How does one experience out-of-body experiences, or how does one develop? What is the kind of training required? And mostly I avoided speaking about it because it's not something one would encourage people to try. Especially if you have a weak nervous system, you might end up in trouble. Most people with a strong body or strong nervous system will have very little experience or no experience. So there's no danger. But those who might have a problem may end up with problems. So I was avoiding that. And then I said, there's a passage that the mother describes. And so as long as I'm staying within that context, it's reasonable to speak about it and share it in a general way. It's a passage which most people don't realize. Mother is actually explaining to you how to have an out-of-body experience or develop this skill. You remember the first passage I read out where she asks, do you have this? Can you do this? And you say, well, I can't, but will you teach me? And so here's Mother telling you how to do it. And I will read from that. So someone asks about dreams. And as part of that, she says, again, in another passage, she explains how you can actually train yourself to have a dream. That is, you're conscious in your dream body, in the part which is projected. As you wake up, you choose to leave the dream as it is, wake up in your physical body, have your day, go back to sleep at night, and re-enter that point where you left the dream and continue the dream. Not only that, she says, at a young age especially, when our minds are, so to say, forming our sense of the life ahead, you can in this way create by visualizing, conceiving mentally the kind of life you would like to have, or the kind of experiences, or the kind of a state of consciousness you want to live. And as if the mind creating a world, and if you infuse into it every day a little bit, you're actually shaping your future, she says. And especially in childhood, she says, that's when we determine our future. Reading that made me review, and something you can also look at. What are the things you conceived as your future? And either those things tended to happen, or they set a direction which guided your future. And sometimes what you conceived had a superficial appearance, but deeper was an intention, which is much more powerful, which has guided. Observe, notice, and you realize how important that period of life is. And she says that's when you could be doing all this. And she's telling that to the children. I don't know how many took advantage. But now she's speaking of dreams, and how to have the dream, or go into the level or the plane of dream that you choose to have as a dream. This is from 1951, January 30, her questions and answers, classes she took. The first step: you must be able to discern the various inner states of being and know for sure this belongs to the vital, this belongs to the mind, this belongs to the psychic, this belongs to matter. As I said earlier, there are sub-degrees in all that. There is a material vital, a vital vital, mental vital, a vital under the psychic influence. So 4 facets to each of these planes. You must be able to classify things very clearly and not allow any mixtures, any vague confusions in yourself. Oh, where does this movement come from? What is it? Indistinct impressions. That is the first step. Now, what is interesting is she's going to describe 3 steps, basically. What is interesting is she seems to be telling you how to go into the dream world, but actually she's teaching you how to have an exteriorization. And the rationale I will explain after we have read this. The 2 processes, in fact, are very similar, or in fact are the same with difference of emphasis. So first step, discerning various inner states of being and distinguishing them, knowing which is what in relation to others. Now, it doesn't mean you will always use a vocabulary. This is vital, mental is that, mental, vital. It's being able to distinguish, this is like this, that is like that, and this is the grade of mind substance is more here than that. Just the qualitative distinction. Naming is not necessary because you have so many fine grades, you won't be able to name them. The distinguishing allows you literally to be able to then shift from one state to another. Okay. Second step, you learn to concentrate in any one of these inner states. You choose the one which you feel to be the most alive, the most developed in yourself, and you learn to concentrate there. Now, there is reason for this before I read further. You could, for example, project yourself out in one of these levels which is for you still not developed. Your capacity to experience things, register things, recall things, or make choices would be practically null because it's not developed. So often what happens for people when they rise above the intellectual mind into a higher state, there's a blurring out, a kind of a blanking out. You feel as if you become stupid, I can't think. And you see these people rushing now to activate the thought to get back to their normal state. Instead of saying, oh, this is a blurred state, but qualitatively it feels higher. Let me adapt myself to it. Let me learn to get familiar. And bit by bit, your consciousness awakes and grows in that state. But if you were given that, and when the mother gives you this, you rush back from it thinking, oh, what's happening? I think I'm about to fall asleep, or I'm growing stupid. You are running away from the gifts she gives. This is in fact one of the biggest reasons for people not to have significant growth of inner and higher ranges of consciousness. And it is similar when we go within, inward. The first movement inward, Mother describes how it feels this blurry. Okay, that's a passage I will read also if I can find it. It becomes so blurry, people become scared. And then they want to rush out. What is this? I'm losing my grip on my sense of I. I'm going to forget myself. And so you rush out. So the choice of concentration should be in the part of you which is most developed. So you choose the one which you feel to be the most alive, the most developed in yourself, and learn to concentrate there, on that layer, in that state of consciousness. And then you do the same exercise, ... I hope whether you remember the exercises you used to do when you were very young in order to walk, to drink, to talk, to hear, to feel. You used to do many exercises. All children do exercises without knowing it, but they do them. So you have to do something on the same lines. You must build up senses and develop them, make them conscious, independent, and precise in their perceptions. So this is the training now. Let's say you have picked a grade of consciousness which is for you the most developed, and generally it will be a vital mental range. For some, it will be the vital enthusiasm with a mental tinge infused. For some, it will be actually a more mental awareness with a vital energy. That's typically the range for most human beings in terms of greatest development. So now you project yourself or concentrate into that state, hold that state, identify with it almost entirely, and there in that you are developing your ability to perceive. You look, you sense, you register the environment in that level. And then you walk, so to say, you wander, you extend, you project, you push, you widen, you narrow, you focus, you widen, etc. So it's literally like a child learning to walk in the physical body that you're now doing in the grade of consciousness which is non-physical. You must build up the senses and develop them, make them conscious, independent, and precise in their perceptions. So at first, perception there becomes as if a blurred perception. Something like this I feel. What do you feel? Concentrate more, and then it becomes more clear. You're developing a skill, developing a capacity. Literally in the occult tradition, they will say you're developing a subtle grade of substance, which becomes now your body to exteriorize or to project or to act. We continue. Each word is important. Huh? Build your senses, develop them, make them conscious, independent, precise in their perceptions. So you can see what a work it is. That is the second stage. It may take time, it may come quickly. It depends on the degree of development of your inner being, because finally it's happening in an inner layer of your consciousness. Now comes the third stage. She doesn't say third, she just says, after that, this is only the beginning. After that, you must learn to isolate yourself from all the other parts of the being, to concentrate on the one where you want to have the experience, and concentrate in such a way that you come into contact with the corresponding outer world. So now when you make yourself exclusively focused in that grade and all else fades out, you are now fully into this. Then you perceive things of that world as if widening out. Now, where is this happening? You're sitting on a chair. You're here. You're sitting on a chair, isn't it? You've not really done an exteriorization. So, I don't mean that it is an exteriorization that leaves your body in a state of coma. No, a very intense concentration is enough. A power to isolate yourself from everything except the place where you are concentrating. And then, when you come into contact with the corresponding world, you must want that, And little by little, you learn how to do it. So the third phase is isolating from everything else until you're exclusively in this, and then extending as if you're perception into that world. And then, of course, little by little, you extend your capacity and so on. And she says this is not exteriorizing. Now you notice the actual training is exactly the same for exteriorizing. In exteriorizing, you would only be projecting that part of yourself outward. The way you project your arms. So right now my arms are as if wrapping around my body. I disengage a part of my physical consciousness, and now I develop the skills of moving it, and now I project it as if an independent projection reaching out into the physical world. Exactly the same thing is happening in this substance, except you don't have a biological arm and your consciousness is plastic. And because it is plastic, your consciousness is able to spontaneously extend, literally like an arm, like a tendril projecting out. Then it's a question of balance. How much you project out, how much you leave in. You can project out more until it becomes as if an independent body form that can go out and wander in that world, in that grade, and your physical body goes into a kind of a sleep. Or you can project a part as if a sense, a perception. Let's say, as an analogy, if your hands, you could see through your skin, you project your hand inside or extend it out into some other room through the window, and you look around through your inner sight. Something like that. Your consciousness projects out, and you explore that subtle world of whatever grade it is your consciousness you projected, and come back, and that's all. Interesting, isn't it? And very simple if you think about it. And here she has taught you the method, even for exteriorization or just basic perception or action. So I don't mean that it is an exteriorization that leaves your body in a state of coma. No. A very intense concentration is enough. A power to isolate yourself from everything except the place where you are concentrating. So now this is projecting to a place, let's say, in the world, in the subtle world. So remember, this started in a context of a dream state. In a dream state, you wandered into a certain world, let's say. Now you want to go back there. Use this to project. States, experiences, spaces even would do the same thing. So you want to, for example, know what is the situation in the grade of consciousness of that grade of a certain people. You could project into that space as a physical space, but on the subtle level. And then you come into contact with the corresponding world. You must want that, and little by little you learn how to do it. So highlighting the gradual progression of the capacity. And there you have the exercise required to improve the senses you have gradually developed and give them a field of action. At first, you may be rather lost in this outer world. You don't feel quite at ease, but little by little you will get used to it and start moving about there in the way that is appropriate to each of these worlds. So again, this one phrase is a whole domain of knowledge which is dealt with in some occult traditions. Each world has its own way, is appropriate to that grade of consciousness. So you see, in the mind, your thoughts are the material, or your thought substance is the material, and your thoughts are the objects made of that material. Literally, what you conceive is what you form. In the vital world, it is the life energy, the impulse of energy, emotions, which form and shape, and so on. And so the way you wander, the way you perceive, each grade has as if its own kind of sight and perception that you have to develop, and way of action that you have to develop. I have touched upon this in one discussion we had long ago, where I had given this example of relationships in the vital plane. You meet a force. If in your consciousness you have fear, you're setting a relationship that gives that force a greater power over you because you fear it. You make yourself vulnerable by the fear itself. Then that thing becomes large and you feel yourself small, and then that can swallow you as if. If at that time you hold the poise of equality and a kind of a courage, a refusal to have fear, and experience energetically the relationship that nothing can affect you. This is just one more little ripple in the ocean. That thing immediately becomes small and shrinks and runs away. So I don't remember now the source anymore. My teacher had shared an experience like this, and on mother's guidance, he used to have some tiger or lion which put a paw on him in the dream. And mother said, you must turn around and look at him straight in the eye, and then he'll go away. And I think it's another incident, perhaps narrated by someone else or by the mother, where the person turns, looks around, and immediately the tiger becomes a cat and runs away. Now, it looks weird in the dream state, because in the dream state, from the physical viewpoint, forms change. Because in the vital world, it's the relationship of energy, not of form. So tiger can become a cat and run away. But if you're afraid, then it can as if swallow you. If it does, energetically, you have been overwhelmed by a greater energy because you set yourself in such a relationship. So each of these worlds has these different ways of being and ways of protecting or acting and so on. So start moving about there in the way that is appropriate to each of these worlds. And she says, generally, no, we don't describe in advance what the world will be like, because then you start imagining, and the imagination ruins the experience itself. And she discusses this. I think this is as far as this selection is concerned. I'll see if I can find. So there was the passage I mentioned where she speaks of what happens when you go inward, and you can easily think that you're losing yourself. Well, I don't find it now easily. The thing is, she says, because the moment you go in, everything becomes formless and it feels blurred. So people say, oh, I'm going to lose myself, or I'm going to fall asleep, or I will lose my sense of identity into something which is formless, and the fear tends to come and so on. And she says this, the only way is to have a prior background by which you know what is to be expected of you and what you need to do and so on. So if there's a familiarity of the spiritual experiences or opening to a deeper or higher consciousness, then one can manage this much more interestingly. So I think this is all. I'll just take a look at some of the questions which have been put online in the chat box. Aditya asks, how is mothers going to subtle worlds and subtle bodies different from Ashwapati in the book of the Traveler of the Worlds? Well, Sri Aurobindo recorded his own experiences, which of course includes also mother's experiences. And everything which is recorded in Savitri as Ashwapati's experiences, Sri Aurobindo himself has been through and documented. It's a living document of all his experiences. The mother herself has been through many of these. We don't know exactly what would be the differences between their experiences, but broadly they were aligned in what they were doing. Entheogenes have a spiritual significance. I don't understand what that word means. But is it helpful? Is exteriorizing helpful in spiritual progress? Buddha Nursery asks. It is not necessary at all for spiritual progress. It is useful for developing knowledge of these worlds and being able to work in those worlds, which is again not needed for the spiritual growth of consciousness. So we have to make a very clear distinction. You could work on developing these capacities and actually have not much spiritual growth, although you would still have a certain mastery in the vital mental levels. Or, which is the approach recommended by Sri Aurobindo, you focus first on the development of your spiritual consciousness, opening to the presence of the self and the psychic being within you. Being firmly rooted within these, you then turn upon the world and all these planes and engage with them. So when, for example, the psychic presence within you comes forward, it awakens, it opens you to these inner ranges and layers within. It enlightens, that is, brings light, awakes through its light, these layers which otherwise are dark and closed to you. And as they grow more aware, you can, of course, explore them, engage with them, interact with them, and so on. But under the direct freedom and therefore safety of the psychic as the predominant influence, or similar experience in the wider external opening through the base of the self, where across all these worlds, the base of the self is there supporting. And therefore you lean back for support on this, and there's nothing in those worlds which can overwhelm you, but also on your part, you have spontaneously the right relation and the right knowledge of what to do and how to deal with those worlds. You may still have to develop skills, but at least the right base and protection is natural and spontaneous. So this would be the better way for us, for the bulk of us. There are people who are drawn to occult knowledge who may not feel the spiritual to be a priority, and it is for them to make that choice and, of course, face the consequent dangers which may come. Harvey asks, crystals are in Mother's and Sri Aurobindo's sadhana. Why should crystals be important? His question is, which crystals are best? Why should crystals be even necessary? I would put it the other way. The consciousness that you infuse into a crystal would give the crystal its value. Crystals are used in certain occult practices because they are natural resonators for certain qualities of consciousness, but also they are natural vehicles into which you can infuse some consciousness. So what is normally done is somebody who has an ability will infuse a certain power into the crystal and then give that crystal to a disciple or to somebody for certain benefits. And the analogy is very similar to a radio. If you notice, the earliest radios were made of crystals. To this day, those radios were called crystal radio sets. What was that? You took a wire, you hung a wire, pulled out one wire from that thing which you hung, touch a tip of the wire to a piece of crystal, galenium typically, I think galenium is the crystal. No, germanium. You touched one tip to germanium, and the other side you connected to the earth, or depending on some variations, you would put your headphones from the crystal then to the earth. The wire, the antenna, is as if picking up everything, all frequencies. What goes through the crystal resonates at certain natural frequencies, and whichever is the stronger signal in those frequencies comes through. It's as if you're picking up all radio waves, but the strongest is the one nearest to you. And that comes into your headphone. So the crystal is your tuning, filtering mechanism. Later, the crystals were replaced by inductors and capacitors to be able to fine tune, and then you can tune easily, more precisely. But it's a similar idea. Right now, within you, all frequencies, all states of consciousness are simultaneously present. You tune into one of them because of the way you are, the state of consciousness you live in. The divine is not far away, it is here. But when you feel and think and align to the divine presence, you open and you feel the infusion. You tune and feel to the vibration of disturbance or anger. Well, you tune into a universal grade of anger. You are the crystal resonating. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't give too much importance to external crystals. And at best, you could, as I said, infuse certain things, but why? Why not directly receive that thing in yourself? Why use a mirror to reflect the sunlight onto you when you can stand in the sun and receive the light directly? So Aditya asks, sometimes while meditating, he feels as if he's sitting in a different room at a work desk. Yes, it could be a part of your mind which is still located there and you're simultaneously in both places, which happens often in dream state and often at night, especially when we travel out. Let's say you are at home for many days, and then suddenly you go to a different place. Sometimes when you wake up from sleep, you will feel distinctly as if you woke up in your own home. And then as you open your eyes, there's a sudden shift, and you find yourself in this new place, and you're lost. Hey, what happened? Where am I? But it's as if during the night, some part of your mental consciousness went back in your bed, in your familiar space. And it takes a while, so to say, for you to come back to this new place. Yes, that can happen also in meditation, but then I will simply say the focus of your meditation is not clear enough. It's still your mind opening out or wandering out. It will be more useful if you focus your mind on a state of a higher or deeper grade. Then these kinds of projections or distractions won't happen. What Mother described as the second and third step, you isolate yourself and then fully focus into a state of consciousness, is what you do in meditation, but now in a spiritual state, inner or higher. And then you have an experience of that state, and then you awaken into that state. Another question from Buddha Nursery. Can you exteriorize oneself and the exteriorized body perform, practicing musical instrument, and retain the memory of that session? In principle, you can learn things and retain the learning when you wake up. But if you're going to play a musical instrument, it's a physical skill. So there's nothing you can do. You don't have a violin to play in your exteriorized state, isn't it? But what you can do, and this is interesting, is you enter in the vital or mental worlds, receive a specific knowledge or experiences, or even a skill or capacity, which is experienced in those planes as a bundle, and you kind of eat or absorb it. You wake up and you're carrying it. So you could do that in a dream state. You could do that in a meditation state. You could do that consciously, receiving, invoking to receive a capacity or a skill and let it settle into you. The problem though is, in the return one loses a lot unless you've consciously built the bridge of continuity of awareness. You wake up from a dream, momentarily you remember the tail end of the dream. By the time you get up, the memory is also gone. So if you received a learning, what has stayed with you of the learning is at best a distant reflection. And at worst, it's completely lost. So that's why the necessity of building this bridge of continuity of awareness. It's a very useful training if you can do that. And I would recommend for all of you to spend time every morning. When you wake up, stay very still. You will read Mother's description of what to do. Stay very still and try consciously to recall, remember the last part of the dream. The moment you move your body, it's as if the part of the consciousness which was projected out snaps back and the link is gone. So you should be very careful not to move the physical body. Go back to that point where you're half awake. Reach out as much as you can of the dream and then hold the thread and try to go backward. What was before, what was before. And then very slowly you shift your awareness to your waking state and keep going back and forth, retaining the memory until you're able to open your eyes and retain the full memory. At that point, if you can write down, it's still useful. Try to write down everything you can. Already by then you'll tend to find it slipping because you're getting more superficially fixed in the physical body. You go take a shower, come back, look at what you've written, you won't remember. Did I write this? What is this memory? This is how you begin. After a few days, after a few weeks, you'll say, yes, I forgot during the shower, I came back. Now writing helped me remember. So you're building a bridge. Eventually, one can reach a point where you wake up and you have continuity of recall all the way from the point where you went into sleep. And at that point, the next night, you can enter that state and continue the dream even. It's a skill. I've met people who have been able to do this. And over the years, as a result, a part of them can remain as if conscious, observing this dream state. And this was one of the Swamis from the Ramakrishna mission, a wonderful man. And he shared with me how in the night, therefore in this part, which is as if watching or registering, if he doesn't like the dream, he can say, I don't want this dream. and change the direction or choose to wake up. Interesting. So Dolores asks, is it one of the bases for remote viewing? Yes, one can do remote viewing in this way. The nature of remote viewing, of course, for practical purposes, is to know what's happening in the physical world. So then projecting in the mental space is not so useful. But if, as was also done in the US military, they would monitor the mental states of various world leaders. So one of the remote viewers records how during the Gulf War, 1991-92, every day they were asked to monitor the state of mind and the immediate plans of Saddam Hussein. So it's as if the remote viewer leaned into his mind, felt what was his overall state. Is he confident? Is he hesitant? Is he willing to negotiate? Is he rigid in his position? And what is the plan that he has immediately? So whatever they could pick up in the mental level in his mind, you could not know what he spoke, but you could pick up the mental state. Then came very interesting influence part, where having identified with his mind, they tried to influence his mind, to nudge his mind in a certain direction, to encourage him to think this way and not that way, and to make choices in the way they wanted, which also apparently was very successful. But it's contact of mind with mind. Remote viewing on a physical level requires as if a part that projects on the more physical, vital, or purely physical. There again, there are two ways broadly. One is, as we have described, a tiny part that exteriorizes. So you're still here, but you project in a kind of a half sleep state. You project, you find yourself as if present, you look, you come back. But when you're present, if someone there is sensitive, they can sense you and nudge you or kick you or push you, whatever, interfere with you. If you come back, they can then trace you back. If they have the skill, they can project themselves and come back to where you are physically located and say, oh, this is the fellow who was spying on us. So this was happening actually between the US and Russia. At times they would project themselves on somebody, and those people had sensitives in Russia who would sense them and chase them back. And then many years later, they met physically after the Cold War was over. They met physically and exchanged notes and said, yes, you were the person. Interestingly, none of them dared to speak to their military heads about what had happened, because they felt that those people would be so close to this idea or would misunderstand what had happened. But between themselves, they knew each other. Interesting. But there's a different way, which is much simpler, and which is generally what is used in military remote viewing more commonly, where you don't project yourself, rather you become like a mirror, with your consciousness very stilled and receptive, and a suggestion is put by someone else, this is what we want you to monitor. You don't know what it is. They just tell you a number. As the number is read out, as if in your consciousness, that state, that experience begins to form. And then you go through a series of steps of drawing, writing, until you end up with an image and with a description. You may not understand what you have seen, but you have a description and an image. The person who raised the question then looks at those documents and says, yes, this answers it. But when you get it, you may have no idea. You just picked up something as if a confused reflection in the mirror state. That cannot be detected by others. That is, they cannot know that you're spying and monitoring them. And this is generally what is more often used. They call it coordinate remote viewing or controlled remote viewing, CRV. And the other where you project yourself is called extended remote viewing, ERV, because it takes an extended period of time, 45 minutes, just to enter the state where you can project yourself, at least for them. How does one create the dwelling place for the psychic? Is from Purkayastha. I think this is the most important question. What in you aspires to receive the psychic? Feel that. Most often it is some part within you which is of a very fine, refined grade of aspiration, devotion. Bhakti is the right word. Devotion is still a more mental mix. Bhakti is spontaneous opening and giving in joy felt in the heart region. That movement, in the very movement of opening and giving, as if opens out with a certain refinement and subtlety, in a vibration very close to the psychic vibration, into which then the psychic influence can begin to fill, and through which it can begin to spread into you. Which is why the importance given by Sri Aurobindo and the Mother of the psychic influence for the inner opening and spiritual growth. If that is not there sufficiently, then the receptive base is in the mind or in the surface emotions, which are too rigid, too coarse, too narrow, and they distort or they limit or they cloud. So it's as if you have to go behind the emotions to this pure bhakti. It's not an emotional feeling. It is not an excitation of devotionalism. It is a stillness and silence deeper behind, into which you feel the spontaneous relationship, self-giving in joy to the Divine Mother. That's your center. Center yourself there, hold that poise, and then turn inward with an aspiration to invoke the influence of the psychic presence, or if that's only an idea, open to the Mother's presence deep within you, because she's seated there as supporting the psychic. So psychic is a part of her. So you turn within inward to receive her presence, either deep from within or from above, as if receiving, and receive that influence. That influence is repeatedly coming, settling, becoming more and more permanent as an influence. From there, radiating in your personality, begins to influence and organize your thoughts, your emotions, your behavior, your priorities, your values, your friendships, your interests. From that influence filling you, certain things spontaneously, effortlessly become more interesting or less interesting. You had habits which just suddenly seem so meaningless, they just drop off. Other things become so much more rich and fulfilling, they begin to fill you. And all of these are aligned to the psychic. And all this influence spreading creates a base of purity into which the psychic influence now comes forward more and more to, so to say, take its seat in your personality. But it's a gradual process of emergence. And as it grows, of course, the whole process amplifies and speeds up. But the first movement is to center yourself in that part of you which is most open, and there to hold, receive, stabilize, and from there allow it to spread more and more into you. I think this would be, in sum, the approach of the practice. There are other questions which perhaps we will take up another time. I think this would be a good point to pause our discussion. I think we have taken just one question, but gone quite deep into it. The most important thing, the greatest priority of your life is, even if you don't recognize it, should be to put yourself in relation with the Divine Presence. It is the Divine Presence which gives value to your life, which brings meaning into all that you do, that you experience. And so the moment you turn to receive, to open, to put yourself in relation to the Presence, everything becomes gradually more and more interesting. Life itself becomes as if more meaningful, more joyous. When the opposite happens, know that the link has faded and make effort to relink. In this process, you are also putting yourself in touch with the primary reason why you took birth. Remember, the one who took birth is not this thinking mind nor these emotions. They are the encasement for the one who took birth. And so the Divine Presence deep within you, the one who took birth, as you put yourself in touch with it, The reason why you took birth also begins to, so to say, flower out. It's a spontaneous, natural, effortless movement. Its influence guiding now navigates the priorities of your life. And you align yourself more and more to why you came on earth. As a result, one of the very interesting things is every circumstance of your life is perceived, at least, as being there to help you. When you are off track from your deeper purpose, everything you do is as if a struggle against which you have to flow. You align yourself, and now everything is there as an aid in your growth. Very interesting, very spontaneous, very quietly done. All that we have discussed of the occult knowledge, extremely valuable to understand. But the thing out of this to recognize is these are all sheaths which the divine presence, the psychic being within you, is meant to wield for the full experience of the universe. And just as your physical body has to be trained and grown, so too these layers also have to be trained and grown to its service. For now, temporarily, your intelligence, which says I am conscious, is the vice regent. That's a phrase Sri Aurobindo uses in Savitri. While the true king, the psychic being, is still too young, his influence not yet strong. So your intellect is the focal point around which you organize your life, but also is the focal point which must then turn towards the presence. So it can be turned through the mind's intellectual form, or the intellect as seated in the heart, not in the emotions, but behind the emotions, which turns. In other words, that which is your center of your being as you experience it has to turn into the source within. A variation, you turn to the source above, around, as the Divine Mother, of whom the psychic being is the representative within you. Either way, or a combination of both of these, is the single most important thing in your life. All else is only there to help you in this, to help you in re-entering in relation with the Divine Mother, with the Divine Soul, and in developing the powers and capacities of your layers for the soul to experience the world. Some of us spend more time developing the powers external, losing the focal point and purpose. Some of us make an effort to find the bridge, the balance between these two. In a way, the circumstances given to you in life are your means of spiritual growth. Whatever you develop in terms of contact with divine presence, these circumstances are the means by which you will infuse this influence into your entire personality, in all the parts, in all the skills, in all the powers of your consciousness, both in your waking state and in your sleep state. So all that we have discussed is very useful, very relevant, because to be able to wander around in those worlds is as important as to be able to wander around in the physical world and do things in the physical plane. Isn't it? But for whom? And so this influence coming forward and taking its place is now the base around which all those other faculties and powers can also naturally, effortlessly, and safely begin to open out. As an aid to bridging this inner and outer ranges of our consciousness, you can work on the memory of the dream state. This would be one side, to create a bridge, so to say, with the inner layers and the surface consciousness. And the other side is at the time of going to sleep, which is the direction in which your consciousness is turned, which decides the state that you go into sleep. If you've just watched a horror movie, you're all rattled with emotions, you go to sleep in that, you will end up in the horror region of the vital worlds. If you've just watched a very beautiful, elevating, idealistic movie, you will end up into the heavenly regions of the vital worlds. But they are vital worlds. You could equally center yourself in your aspiration, turn the aspiration to the divine presence within, and slip inwards as if towards the source and drift into sleep with that, with the intention to remain immersed in the psychic influence within you, in the soul's radiance. That, of course, will give you the best quality of sleep also, but also allow that influence to now fill you more and more, because as you return from that deep sleep state, even if other layers of your consciousness have wandered into those worlds, they will be turned to the parts of the worlds where the psychic influence is strong, and so suffused with that light. And as you wake up, your surface personality will receive this influence more and more. How would you do that? Find your own way. You may listen to mother's music, you may read a few lines from Savitri, or you may simply turn in quiet bhakti, devotion, love, aspiration to the divine within. Stay immersed in it for a while and then drift into sleep with that. How you do is not so important. Enter sleep with this, exit sleep with conscious attempt to recall and build continuity of consciousness from the dream state to waking state. These are two exercises which will enormously accelerate the bridging of the inner and outer. And with this intention, then the psychic influence comes forward much more and increasingly takes its place centered in the temple that is your being, that is being prepared for the presence. Let us make a conscious effort to put this into practice over the next few days. And we will close with the concentration in this aspiration and with this sense of purpose. Namaste. Thank you.
Namaste. Thank you for such an inspiring class.